This video briefly examines extract 5 of the F585 stimulus material. For further information on videos on globalization, see my 2 videos on that topic. Globalization is the increasing integration and interdependence of world economies. I put a few further ideas here about the death of distance, this combination of technological, institutional and economic integration that makes the nation state less and less of the relevant economic unit. But the main dimensions along which this globalization has progressed is explained for you in the bullet point list in the stimulus that we'll examine next. The most important vector of globalization is the growth in the trade in goods and services, freer trade. And that's been promoted largely by the reduction in tariffs and non-tariff barriers orchestrated by GATT and WTO, and also through regional economic groupings. We know that the trade has grown by a phenomenal 5.2% on average between 1990 and 2010, but it has slowed in recent years, as explained in extract 4. The figure for 2013 is only 2.2%, 2014 3.1%. The figure predicted for 2015 is 4%. That's the annual growth in world trade that has slowed recently. With growth in world trade, the economy becomes more global and each economy becomes more open. The second vector is the greater transfer of financial capital and the integration of global markets. This particularly occurred since the 1980s with the abolishing of many exchange controls, and IT has allowed us to integrate quite greatly. There is a very global ownership of financial assets, which is partly of great benefit to the world, because greater FDI and lending, particularly from developed to developing countries, can allow developing countries out of the cycle of poverty because they have low savings. So think of the Harrod-Domar model and the importance of Western countries providing for third world debt, but that creates the problems of developing country debt, and also the global financial markets mean there's a lot of risk of contagion when there's a financial crisis, as we've seen recently and in the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Technology transfer is a huge driver of growth in the world, so you get the idea that ideas diffuse globally, particularly from FDI, which is very, very helpful to the growth of the world economies. Basically, if one country has an idea, hopefully we can all benefit from that. Instead of trading in goods, we could trade in factors of production. So when you have an advantage, say because of hexarolin, because of a lot of labour, so maybe you can export some of that labour instead of the goods, and that external emigration could help you with higher wages as a developing country, and the internal migration can help with the productivity in developed countries. Ultimately, this should be a source of allocative efficiency. There is a growth of global brands, and that accounts for some of the intra-industry trade, as does the fragmentation of component processes in production, thanks to globalization, and the inclusion of more economies in the global trading system has been a major component of globalization. The joining of transition economies, those former communist countries, into the world capitalist system, such as China's WTO accession, and the emerging economies of the developing world becoming more part of the global trading system, has increased global trade and the similarity and connection between countries. There are many causes of globalization. I've split them into technological, reduced transport costs, information technology, communications technology, and other advances that have allowed the death of distance. Institutional changes, the reduction of trade barriers being the main one, and controls of foreign exchange. This is particularly the case within regional economic groupings, the trade blocs we've talked about before, and of course the process of liberalisation of trade pioneered by the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade GATT and the WTO. That's also IMF, World Bank and other institutions of promoting globalization. Geopolitical changes in world politics, particularly the collapse of communism, allowing the transition economies to join the world of capitalism, China being a huge issue there, and indeed the end of the license raj in India has made it a more capitalist country, and change in the nature of corporations. They've become much more global, becoming multinational, known as transnational corporations, and financial markets have become more global. The IMF view, which we loosely call the Washington Consensus view, is that globalization is great. Their view is that any problems with globalization at the moment argue for more globalization. There's not been enough yet than less. I've put down the three principal reasons here, but the piece is quite clear, identifying the advantages of globalization. That principally you get, with openness to trade, you get high levels of growth. You get a variety of goods, you get low prices, you get better jobs, you can afford better health outcomes, and this reduces poverty. Globalization has reduced absolute poverty, and this is something which was one of the Millennium Development Goals, with a huge reduction in the number of people living on less than $1 a day. There are still quite a lot of people who do live in absolute poverty, but it has reduced. There's a note here about whether that's happened in sub-Saharan Africa. The number of people in absolute poverty has increased there, although the percentage has decreased. The question is, what happens with inequality? Because with globalization there has been an increase in inequality. But there is a view that in the first stages of growth and industrialization, because only the few can own capital at the beginning, you get a high increase in inequality, but over time, as the economy develops into maturity, the benefits of growth are spread more evenly. This pattern is called the Kuznets curve, the benefits of growth being spread more equally over time. The other thing to point out is that much of the rise in countries with inequality has been in countries which are developed, not the developing countries. So the developing countries may suffer some things from globalization, but it is also and mainly a huge opportunity for them. Joseph Stiglitz takes the view that globalization hasn't really helped the majority of people. The former Nobel Prize winner used to work for the IMF but rejected its methods and the Washington Consensus. His principal argument is that many in the developing world still suffer and probably are more precarious thanks to globalization, that where it helps the developed countries grow very rich from increased global trade, but the developing countries don't do very well, or at least the people that do well in developing countries are the wealthy, not the poor. And in developed countries, the people who do well are the wealthy, not the poor. Losers include those workers that have been who've lost their jobs thanks to globalization in developed countries, the offshore workers here. He would take issue with the trickle-down argument that the Kuznets curve will sort itself out, because he would say that the rich and developing countries will probably spend on fancy imports anyway, rather than spend on the kind of agricultural products of the mass of poor in their countries. His normative point is that the whole unequal nature of globalization is morally unacceptable. Looking at his words directly, there are some key terms here. Balance, again, a theme running throughout this stimulus. The outcome of globalization is unbalanced in the sense that it's not inclusive. It hasn't helped the poor as much as the rich. And sustainability, a major topic in development economics. For him, inequality and the growing inequality and the continued marginalisation of the poor with globalisation, and indeed the marginalisation of the formerly included sort of working class of the developed world, thanks to global trade growth, is a politically unsustainable thing. You can see his focus here is the aspirations of people and the voice they have, that it affects communities. Therefore, we could look at the costs of inequalities on this topic here, i.e. social unrest, civil disobedience, strikes, a self-perpetuating poverty cycle, capital investment being skewed to rich, production being skewed towards the rich, lower domestic consumption as the rich spend on imports, ultimately unsustainable process of growth that only supports the very rich. We'll move on now to look at the figure he gives of 59% of the world's people living in countries with growing inequality. It's very, very sort of unfairly chosen data in my view. It's certainly true that this figure obtains, but the main point, as we'll see when we look at the figures directly, is that the vast majority of those countries are the developed countries, and the inequality has been declining in many developing countries. This is the growth of the middle classes in China and India, which is a very big story at reducing inequality in the world. Furthermore, the high growth rates of developing countries has reduced world inequality, even if the inequality within countries of the world has increased. This is a key point and a key point of evaluation and comment that will come up in this exam. Here is the raw data to which Stiglitz refers. First of all, it's only from the 60s to the 1990s, and secondly, you can see that 19 of the developing countries, as opposed to 15, are in have stable inequality or declining inequality. It depends how you read this data. It's certainly not great news for the effect of globalization on equality, don't get me wrong, but it's not quite as bald as suggested by Stiglitz. It's certainly true that globalization has challenged levels of equality in developed countries, particularly the increased competition of trade from low-wage economies and migration. But of course, that very competition and migration has increased the equality in the world, helping other countries to catch up. There are other arguments against globalization that you could bring to bear in your essays. One, that globalization promotes specialization in primaries in developing countries which are undynamic. They don't promote the technology and learning by doing for growth. Similarly, such specialization in primaries will inevitably lead to less wealth generated from trade, because the terms of trade tend to fall with primaries. This is known as the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, that even if you have a very valuable natural resource in your country as a developing country, the over-specialization in that can cause your exchange rate to appreciate, thus causing your other industries to wither on the vine. And also that if you over-specialize in goods like primaries, they tend to be volatile because they have inelastic supply and demand. Have a look at how that will analyze how that will work on a supply and demand diagram. Price is volatile when the curves are steep, and this can cause all sorts of problems in developing countries. And for developed particularly, but also developing countries, if people are occupationally immobile, then opening up to world trade and globalization means you're constantly changing the structure of your trade. Suddenly it's another country that's better at one of the things that you were doing, and your people have to change jobs. If they're immobile, they can't change jobs. We get unemployment, structural unemployment, as a result of trade. All this growth and transport can create negative externalities of production, pollution, CO2 emissions, and that might not be sustainable. For all the, even if you think that globalization drives very fast growth. Of course, fast growth itself is responsible for much of the CO2 emissions. And as discussed previously, globalization creates winners and losers. Winners win big in globalization. It's a greater market for skilled labour, for example, greater opportunities for capital to find profit. This means that the rich get richer. The poor in developed countries, at the very least, can suffer from increased competition from abroad. So we have a rise in inequality as a possible consequence of globalization. So I'm going to summarise by looking at the two polar opposite perspectives on globalisation. And as a rare punishment, I'm going to do it in my own handwriting rather than typing it out for you. I will read it to you though, so you can decipher my scrawl. On the one side is the orthodox Washington consensus view. This is associated with free market, right-wing, monetarist and classical economics, if you're going to put it in one camp or another. This stresses the power of comparative advantage in trade and the advantage of specialisation, thanks to the classical economic model of Ricardo and Adam Smith. It focuses on the fact that you get much more growth via the openness of trade, that you get higher living standards because of this economic growth. As much as we might think GDP is not the whole deal when it comes to standard of living, it's the main thing, of course. Beyond just the growth that you get from trade, you get the benefits of economies of scale, creating more allocative, more productive efficiency, competition, more allocative efficiency, and more choice, all of which seems to promote lower prices for consumers, to cut it to its simplest. Lower tax revenue that the government gets from higher growth through trade allows for a looser monetary policy in promoting investment. There's technology transfer thanks to globalisation, and we know technology is very important to growth. The diffusion of talent and management practice, human capital, technique, thanks to FDI, multinational corporations and so on, should further promote technology and human capital growing the economy. And that ultimately there is less poverty, much less absolute poverty in developing countries, and that's largely because of openness to trade. And you just have to look at the different fortunes in the last 50 years of Asia, which has been very open to trade and gone for that Washington consensus model with the Asian tiger economies, countries like Hong Kong, Singapore and so forth, and the countries of the Middle East and Africa and India, which largely look to protect their economies, to see that there is pretty much a clear empirical connection between openness to trade and high levels of growth. But growth isn't everything. That has to be borne in mind. The radical, or let's look at the other side of the equation now, the radical anti-globalization, the Euro-socialist, associated with a left-wing view, and then, well, they look for a start at the sustainability problem and the environmental cost of globalization. It's double trouble environmentally, globalization, because you've got a lot more transport of goods and services, as well as the growth in production of goods and services, both of which have carbon effects. The benefits of globalization are not shared equitably. This is across both the vector of different countries, developed and developing countries, but also within countries, the view that the wealthy benefit more than the poor. Again, on a similar vein, transnational corporations are said to gain at the expense of less economically developed countries, and that this undermines governments, that there's a real theme here that developing country governments cannot set their own policies and look after their own people against the power of global corporations. The World Trade Organization and other trade-obsessed institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF run the show, according to this view, to the benefit of the sort of lobby groups in developed countries. This views the Washington consensus more like a Washington conspiracy. One of the iconic sort of symbols of globalization are the sweatshops, the mass production line labour in developing countries. We know the kind of conditions that those people work in, very, very poor conditions. This is the problem with globalization. Another thing that globalization promotes is cultural exchange, and the dominance particularly of Western capitalist culture, and that cultural homogeneity is seen as a bad thing and a damaging thing. This is the kind of McDonald's no logo kind of argument. The race to the bottom is a specific point as well as a more general one, which is that in order to attract FDI, countries have to have lower taxes all the time in order to get people to come in their country. This fatally undermines their ability to run a sort of social democratic country, and also there's a race to the bottom with environmental regulations to attract firms to locate in your country, which also, or indeed human rights legislation or worker legislation, all of which damages the environment and equality. Race to the bottom refers to reducing tax or regulation to try and attract global finance and global firms and transnationals to locate in your country. It's putting the power into the corporations' hands rather than governments. And transnational corporations are very footloose. They move wherever they can to avoid tax. They're a very mobile tax base, so ultimately it might be self-defeating for countries to try and encourage them to locate, because sooner or later they will up sticks and leave, and this kind of instability could damage countries irreparably. Polar political perspectives on globalization. Two different camps. Here are the main points that you could bring to bear if you're evaluating globalization, which may well be one of the questions. So, probable questions. I feel sure that the question will centre around something like the effect of globalization on developed and developing countries. Contrasting those will be crucial in that comment. There's certainly a lot to get your teeth into when you talk about that, or something more specific on inequality in globalization. Thank you for listening.